and the Seven Dwarfs. Welcome to the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This is a tale about kindness, jealousy, love, and the triumph of good over evil. This is a perfect way to English listening practice. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our video on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Today, we will learn about Snow White, a kind princess, and her journey with the Seven Dwarfs. This story teaches us valuable lessons about kindness, bravery, and the importance of love and friendship. It also reminds us that true beauty comes from within, and evil will never win in the end. So, are you ready to hear the full story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Let's watch together. Chapter 1. A Jealous Queen. Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there was a beautiful princess named Snow White. She had bright, fair skin like snow, red lips like a rose, and black hair as dark as ebony. Snow White was kind, gentle, and loved by everyone who met her. Snow White's mother passed away when she was very young. Her father, the king, remarried a woman who was beautiful but very vain and wicked. This woman was the queen. She was so obsessed with her beauty that she could not bear to think anyone was more beautiful than she was. The queen had a special magic mirror. Every day, she would ask the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror would answer, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." The queen was happy with this answer. She loved hearing that she was the most beautiful woman in the land. But one day, the mirror spoke differently. "Queen," the mirror said, "Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen was shocked and angry. She could not believe that someone, especially her stepdaughter, was more beautiful than her. The queen's jealousy grew. She became filled with hate and wanted to be the most beautiful again. The queen ordered her huntsman to take Snow White far into the forest and to never bring her back. She thought that if Snow White was gone, she would always be the fairest. The huntsman took Snow White into the forest. But when he looked at her kind face, he could not do it. He felt sorry for Snow White and let her go. He told her to run away and never return to the palace. Snow White, confused and scared, ran deeper into the forest, not knowing where to go. She wandered for a long time until she came upon a small cottage. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. Snow White entered the cottage and saw that it was empty. The cottage was small but cozy. There were 7 little beds in one room and 7 little chairs around a table. It seemed like the house of a family. Tired and hungry, Snow White lay down on one of the beds and fell asleep. She hoped that someone would come to help her. Chapter 2. The Huntsman's Mercy. As the years passed, Snow White grew into a young woman. She became more beautiful with each day. Her gentle nature and kind heart made her loved by everyone in the kingdom. The queen, however, grew more jealous. Every morning, she asked her magic mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" One day, the mirror gave an answer that made her furious. It said, "Queen, you are beautiful, but Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen could not believe her ears. Her jealousy burned like fire in her heart. "I must get rid of Snow White," she thought. "I will not allow her to take my place as the fairest in the land." She called for her huntsman, a man who was loyal and skilled. "Take Snow White deep into the forest," the queen commanded. "I do not want her to return. Make sure she is gone forever." The huntsman was shocked. He had always been loyal to the queen, but Snow White was kind and innocent. How could he harm her? Yet, he knew he had to obey the queen's order. The next day, the huntsman told Snow White, "The queen wants us to go to the forest to gather flowers for her." Snow White smiled and agreed. She loved nature and was happy to help. They walked deep into the forest. The trees grew tall and thick, and the sunlight barely reached the ground. Snow White picked flowers along the way, unaware of the huntsman's troubled thoughts. When they reached a quiet clearing, the huntsman stopped. He could not hold back his tears. "I cannot do this, Snow White," he said. Snow White looked at him with confusion. "What is wrong?" she asked. "The queen wants you gone," the huntsman said. "She ordered me to harm you, but I cannot. You are innocent and kind. Run away, Snow White. Run far into the forest where the queen will never find you." Snow White's eyes filled with tears. She was frightened and did not know what to say. "Thank you for sparing me," she finally whispered. "I will leave and never return." The huntsman gave her a small knife. "Take this to protect yourself," he said. "Be careful and may good fortune follow you." Snow White nodded and began to run. The forest was dark and full of strange sounds. She heard the howls of wolves and the rustle of leaves. Twigs scratched her arms and tears streamed down her face. She was scared and alone. Meanwhile, the huntsman returned to the queen. He told her that he had done as she asked. To convince her, he showed her the heart of a wild animal, pretending it belonged to Snow White. The queen was pleased and believed that Snow White was gone forever, but Snow White was alive. She wandered deeper into the forest, looking for a safe place to rest. As the night grew colder, she stumbled upon a small cottage. The windows glowed with warm light and smoke rose from the chimney. Snow White knocked on the door, but no one answered. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cottage was cozy and clean, with 7 little chairs around a table and 7 little beds lined up in a row. She was so tired that she lay down on one of the beds and fell asleep. Snow White hoped that the kind owners of the cottage would help her. Back at the palace, the queen smiled at her reflection in the mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall," she asked again, "who is the fairest of them all?" But the mirror replied, "Queen, you are fair, but Snow White, alive in the forest, is still the fairest of them all." The queen's face darkened with anger. "Snow White is alive," she hissed. "I will find her, and this time I will make sure she is gone forever." Little did she know, Snow White was safe for now. She had found shelter, and her journey had just begun. Chapter 3: The Cottage in the Woods. Snow White ran deep into the forest. The trees were tall, and their branches blocked the sunlight. The forest was dark and full of strange sounds. She heard the howling of wolves, the hoot of owls, and the rustling of leaves. Snow White was very scared. The ground was uneven, and her feet hurt from walking. She stumbled over roots and bushes, but kept moving. She did not know where she was going, but she had to find a safe place. Finally, she saw a small clearing in the forest. There, hidden among the trees, was a little cottage. Smoke came out of the chimney, and the windows glowed with warm light. Snow White felt a little bit of hope. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. "Hello?" she called. "Is anyone home?" When no one replied, she gently pushed the door open. The cottage was cozy and clean. There was a small wooden table with 7 tiny chairs around it. On the table were 7 plates, 7 cups, and 7 spoons. Everything was very small, as if made for children. Snow White looked around. She saw 7 little beds lined up in a row. Each bed had a soft blanket and a fluffy pillow. Snow White smiled for the first time that day. This must be the home of 7 kind children, she thought. She was very tired and hungry. On the table, there was bread, cheese, and a pitcher of water. She ate a small piece of bread and drank some water. "I will only take a little," she said to herself. "I do not want to be rude." After eating, Snow White felt sleepy. She tried each bed until she found one that was just the right size. She lay down and fell fast asleep. As night fell, the owners of the cottage returned home. They were not children, but 7 dwarfs who worked in the nearby mountains. They spent their days mining for gold and precious stones. The dwarfs carried tools and lanterns as they walked into the cottage. They were surprised to see that the door was open. "Who has been in our house?" asked one of the dwarfs. "Look, said another. Someone has eaten our bread and drank our water, added a third. The dwarfs looked around the cottage. Someone has been sitting in my chair, said one. Someone is sleeping in my bed, cried another. They all gathered around the bed where Snow White was sleeping. Who is this girl? They whispered. She is not one of us. Snow White woke up and saw the 7 dwarfs standing around her. She was startled, but quickly sat up. Oh, I am so sorry, she said. I did not mean to intrude. I was lost in the forest and needed a place to rest. The dwarfs looked at her kindly. Who are you? One of them asked. My name is Snow White, she said. I ran away from my stepmother, the queen. She wants to harm me because her magic mirror said I am more beautiful than her. The dwarfs nodded. The queen is wicked, said one. You can stay here with us. We will keep you safe. Snow White felt a wave of relief. Thank you so much, she said. I will take care of your cottage while you work. I can cook, clean, and make your home cozy. The dwarf smiled and agreed. We work all day in the mines, they said. If you take care of the cottage, we will protect you. Snow White began her new life with the dwarfs. Every morning, they left for the mines, carrying their tools and lanterns. Snow White stayed behind to clean the cottage, wash the dishes, and prepare dinner. She sang as she worked, filling the cottage with music. The animals of the forest often came to visit her. Birds, squirrels, and rabbits watched her as she worked, bringing joy to her day. The dwarfs returned every evening, tired but happy. Snow White always had a warm meal ready for them. She made soups, stews, and fresh bread. The cottage was always clean and welcoming. Snow White felt safe and happy with the dwarfs. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel scared or alone. However, the queen had not forgotten about Snow White. Every day, she asked her magic mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror always gave the same answer. Queen, you are fair, but Snow White, living in the forest with the 7 dwarfs, is the fairest of them all. The queen's anger grew. Snow White is alive, she hissed. I will find her, and this time, I will make sure she is gone forever. The queen began to plan a way to harm Snow White. She was determined to be the fairest in the land, no matter the cost. Unaware of the queen's plans, Snow White continued her peaceful life with the dwarfs. They became like a family to her. They laughed, shared stories, and looked out for one another. The dwarfs warned her to be careful. Do not open the door for strangers, they said. The queen is clever and may try to trick you. Snow White promised to be cautious. She felt safe in the cottage and trusted the dwarfs to protect her. But danger was closer than she realized. The queen's jealousy and evil plans would soon bring trouble to Snow White's peaceful life. Snow White's journey was far from over, and the challenges ahead would test her courage and kindness. But for now, she was happy, surrounded by her new friends in the cozy cottage in the woods. Chapter 4. The Queen's Tricks. Snow White ran through the dark forest. She was frightened and tired. She didn't know where to go, but she kept walking. After some time, she saw a small cottage hidden among the trees. It looked warm and safe. Snow White knocked on the door, but no one answered. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cottage was tiny but cozy. There was a small table with 7 little chairs around it. On the table were 7 plates, 7 cups, and 7 forks. Snow White noticed a row of 7 small beds upstairs. Each bed had a name carved on it: Doc, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, Bashful, Sneezy, and Dopey. Snow White smiled. This must be the home of children, she thought. Snow White was very hungry and tired. She saw some bread and water on the table. I hope they don't mind if I take a little, she said softly. She ate a small piece of bread and drank a little water. After eating, she cleaned up the table. Then, she went upstairs and lay down on one of the beds. I'll rest for a moment, she thought. Soon, she fell into a deep sleep. The cottage belonged to 7 dwarfs who worked in a nearby mine. They spent their days digging for gold and gems. That evening, they returned home, singing a cheerful song. When they entered the cottage, they noticed something was different. "Who sat in my chair?" asked Doc. "Who ate from my plate?" said Grumpy. "Who drank from my cup?" asked Happy. "Someone has been here," said Sleepy. The dwarfs looked around the cottage. When they went upstairs, they saw Snow White sleeping in one of the beds. The noise woke Snow White. She sat up and saw 7 little men standing around her bed. "Who are you?" asked Doc. "My name is Snow White," she said. "I'm sorry for coming into your home without permission. I had nowhere else to go." Snow White told the dwarfs her story. She explained how her stepmother, the queen, wanted to harm her because of her beauty. "The queen ordered a huntsman to kill me, but he let me go," she said. "I ran into the forest and found your cottage." The dwarfs listened carefully. They felt sorry for Snow White. "You can stay with us," said Document, "but you must be careful. The queen is dangerous." "Thank you," Snow White said with a smile. "I will cook, clean, and take care of your home to repay your kindness." The dwarfs agreed, and Snow White began her new life in the cottage. Snow White kept her promise. She cleaned the cottage, cooked delicious meals, and made the home warm and cheerful. The dwarfs were happy to have her there. "Be careful when we are not home," said Document. "The queen might try to find you." "Don't open the door for anyone," said Grumpy. Snow White promised to be careful. She felt safe and loved in the dwarf's home. Meanwhile, the queen stood in front of her magic mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" she asked. The mirror replied, "Queen, you are fair, but Snow White, who lives in the forest with the 7 dwarfs, is the fairest of them all." The queen was furious. "Snow White is alive," she screamed. "I must get rid of her myself." The queen disguised herself as an old woman. She wore ragged clothes and carried a basket with a shiny new corset. She walked to the dwarf's cottage and knocked on the door. "Good day, my dear," said the old woman. "I have beautiful corsets for sale. Would you like to try one?" Snow White hesitated. "The dwarfs told me not to open the door for strangers," she said. "But look how lovely this corset is," said the old woman. "It will make you look even more beautiful." Snow White opened the door a little and took the corset. The old woman helped her put it on. But she pulled the strings too tight, and Snow White couldn't breathe. She fell to the floor. The queen smiled and left, thinking Snow White was gone forever. When the dwarfs returned home, they found Snow White lying on the floor. "What happened?" They cried. They loosened the corset, and Snow White began to breathe again. She told them about the old woman. "That was the queen in disguise," said Document. "You must not open the door to anyone." "I promise," said Snow White. The queen returned to her castle and asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "Queen, you are fair, but Snow White, who lives in the forest with the 7 dwarfs, is the fairest of them all." The queen was furious. "I will try again," she said. This time, she disguised herself as a different old woman. She carried a poisoned comb. She knocked on the cottage door. "Good day, my dear," she said. "I have a beautiful comb for your hair." Snow White remembered the dwarf's warning. "I cannot open the door," she said. "You don't need to," said the old woman. "Just take the comb as a gift." Snow White took the comb and used it in her hair. As soon as the comb touched her scalp, she fell to the floor. When the dwarfs came home, they found Snow White lying on the floor. They removed the comb, and Snow White woke up. "You must not trust anyone," said Grumpy. "I will be more careful," said Snow White. Snow White was safe for now, but the queen was determined to try again. Would Snow White be able to escape the queen's next trick? The story continues. The queen stood before her magic mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" she asked. The mirror replied, "Queen, you are fair, but Snow White, who lives with the 7 dwarfs, is the fairest of them all." The queen was furious. "Snow White is alive," she shouted. "I must get rid of her myself." The queen began to plan her evil tricks. The queen disguised herself as an old woman. She wore ragged clothes and carried a basket with a shiny, beautiful corset. She walked through the forest to the dwarf's cottage. When she arrived, she knocked on the door. Snow White opened a small window. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am a poor old woman selling beautiful corsets," said the queen. "Would you like to try one? It will make you look even more beautiful." Snow White hesitated. "The dwarfs told me not to open the door to strangers," she said. "But look at this lovely corset," said the old woman. "It is a gift for you." Snow White felt sorry for the old woman. She opened the door and let her in. The queen helped Snow White put on the corset, but she pulled the strings so tight that Snow White could not breathe. Snow White fell to the floor. The queen laughed. "Now you will never be the fairest," she said, and left the cottage. When the 7 dwarfs returned home, they found Snow White lying on the floor. "What happened?" they cried. They quickly loosened the corset, and Snow White began to breathe again. She woke up and told them about the old woman. "That was the queen in disguise," said Document. "You must not open the door to anyone." "I promise I won't," said Snow White. Back at the castle, the queen stood in front of her mirror again. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" she asked. The mirror replied, "Queen, you are fair, but Snow White, who lives with the 7 dwarfs, is the fairest of them all." The queen was even angrier. "I will try again," she said. This time, she disguised herself as a different old woman. She carried a comb dipped in poison. She walked to the dwarf's cottage and knocked on the door. "Good day, my dear," said the old woman. "I have a beautiful comb for your hair. Would you like it?" Snow White looked out of the window. "I cannot open the door," she said. "You don't need to," said the old woman. "Take the comb as a gift. You can reach it through the window." Snow White thought the comb looked lovely. She opened the window a little and took the comb. She placed it in her hair. As soon as the comb touched her scalp, Snow White fell to the floor. When the dwarfs came home, they found Snow White lying on the floor again. "What happened this time?" they cried. They saw the comb in her hair and quickly removed it. Snow White woke up and told them about the old woman. "That was the queen again," said Grumpy. "You must not take anything from strangers." "I will be more careful," said Snow White. The queen was furious. She returned to her mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "Queen, you are fair, but Snow White, who lives with the 7 dwarfs, is the fairest of them all." The queen could not control her rage. "This is my last chance," she said. She disguised herself as an old woman one more time. This time, she carried a basket of apples. One of the apples was shiny and red. It was poisoned. The queen went to the dwarf's cottage and knocked on the door. Snow White looked out of the window. "Good day, my dear," said the old woman. "I have delicious apples. Would you like to try one?" Snow White shook her head. "I cannot take anything from strangers," she said. "This apple is very special," said the old woman. "Here, I will eat half to show you it is safe." The old woman took a bite from the apple's white side, which was not poisoned. Then she handed the red side to Snow White. Snow White trusted the old woman. She took the apple and bit into it. As soon as Snow White bit the apple, she fell to the floor. The poison was strong, and Snow White could not wake up. The queen laughed. "Now you will never be the fairest," she said, and left the cottage. When the dwarfs came home, they found Snow White lying on the floor. They tried to wake her, but nothing worked. They cried and placed her in a glass coffin. The dwarfs watched over Snow White, hoping for a miracle. Would Snow White wake up? The story continues. The queen stood before her magic mirror once again. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" she asked. The mirror replied, "Queen, you are fair, but Snow White, who lives with the 7 dwarfs, is the fairest of them all." The queen was furious. "I must get rid of her for good," she said. She made a poisoned apple. It looked shiny and red, but one bite would make anyone fall into a deep sleep. The queen disguised herself as an old woman. She wore ragged clothes and carried a basket of apples. "This time, I will succeed," she said, and set off for the dwarf's cottage. Snow White was alone in the cottage. The 7 dwarfs had gone to work in the forest. There was a knock at the door. Snow White looked out of the window and saw an old woman. "Good day, my dear," said the old woman. "I have fresh apples. Would you like one?" Snow White hesitated. "The dwarfs told me not to open the door to strangers," she said. "Don't worry," said the old woman. "These apples are harmless. Look, I will eat one to show you." The queen took a bite from the apple's white side, which was not poisoned. "See? It is safe," she said, smiling. Snow White felt sorry for the old woman. "You seem kind," she said. "I will take one apple." Snow White opened the door and took the shiny red apple. She thanked the old woman and took a bite. As soon as she bit into the apple, Snow White fell to the floor. Her eyes closed, and she did not move. The queen laughed. "Now you will never wake up," she said. She left the cottage, sure that Snow White was gone forever. When the 7 dwarfs returned home, they found Snow White lying on the floor. "Snow White," they cried. "What happened?" They tried to wake her, but nothing worked. They shook her, called her name, and even tried to give her water, but Snow White remained still. "She is in a deep sleep," said Doc. The dwarfs looked for clues and found the bitten apple. "It must be poison," said Grumpy. The dwarfs were heartbroken. They did not want to bury Snow White because she looked so beautiful, even in her sleep. The dwarfs built a glass coffin for Snow White. They placed her inside so they could always see her. They carried the coffin to a hill and placed it under a tree. Every day, the dwarfs took turns watching over her. They hoped that one day, she would wake up. "She was kind and gentle," said Happy. "She does not deserve this." "We will wait," said Document. "Maybe a miracle will happen." The forest animals loved Snow White. They visited the glass coffin and kept her company. Birds sang soft songs, and deer rested nearby. The animals missed Snow White's smile and hoped she would wake up soon. One day, a prince rode through the forest. He saw the glass coffin on the hill and stopped to look. "Who is this beautiful girl?" he asked the dwarfs. "This is Snow White," said Document. "She was tricked by the evil queen and fell into a deep sleep." The prince felt sad. He had heard stories about Snow White's kindness and beauty. "May I say goodbye to her?" he asked. The dwarfs agreed. Chapter 5: The Prince's Kiss. In a faraway kingdom, a kind and brave prince heard a story. People spoke of a beautiful girl who lay asleep in a glass coffin. "She is the fairest maiden in the land," they said. "She sleeps in the forest, watched over by 7 dwarfs." The prince was curious. "Who is this girl?" he wondered. "I must see her for myself." The prince rode his white horse through the forest. He asked the animals for help. Birds flew ahead to guide him, and deer showed him the path. Finally, he saw the glass coffin on a hill. The dwarfs stood around it, guarding Snow White. The prince dismounted his horse and approached the dwarfs. "Who is this girl?" he asked. "This is Snow White," said Document. "She is kind and gentle, but the evil queen tricked her with a poisoned apple. She has been asleep ever since." The prince looked at Snow White through the glass. Her face was peaceful, and her beauty shone like the morning sun. "She is truly the fairest of them all," he said softly. The prince felt a deep love for Snow White, even though she lay asleep. "I wish I could help her," he said to the dwarfs. "Nothing has worked," said Grumpy. "We have tried everything to wake her." The prince thought for a moment. "May I say goodbye to her?" he asked. The dwarfs nodded. "Yes, you may," said Document. "You seem kind and sincere." The prince stepped closer to the glass coffin. He opened it carefully and knelt beside Snow White. "Even in sleep, you are the most beautiful and kindest maiden," he said. "You deserve to live and be happy." He leaned forward and kissed her gently on the forehead. Suddenly, Snow White's eyes fluttered open. She blinked and looked around. "Where am I?" she asked. The dwarfs gasped. "Snow White, you are awake," they cried. Snow White sat up and saw the prince. "Who are you?" she asked. "I am a prince from a nearby kingdom," he said. "I heard about you and came to see you." "You broke the spell," said Document. Your kiss woke her up. Snow White smiled. "Thank you for saving me," she said. The dwarfs were overjoyed. They danced and sang around Snow White. "We missed you so much," said Happy. "I missed all of you too," said Snow White. She hugged each dwarf and thanked them for taking care of her. The prince watched Snow White with admiration. "You are not only beautiful, but also kind," he said. "Will you come to my kingdom and be my queen?" Snow White looked at the dwarfs. "I will miss you all, but I will come back to visit," she promised. The dwarfs nodded. "We want you to be happy," said Document. "Go with the prince and live your life." Chapter 6. The Happy Ending. Snow White was safe and happy with the prince. He was kind and gentle, and they quickly grew close. They spent time talking and laughing together. The prince admired Snow White for her beauty and kindness. Snow White was grateful for his bravery and care. Soon, they both realized they were in love. The prince said, "Snow White, will you marry me and be my queen?" Snow White smiled. "Yes, I will," she said. The prince and Snow White wanted their wedding to be a joyful celebration. "We must invite the dwarfs," Snow White said. "They are my dear friends and my family in the forest." The prince agreed. "Of course. They should have a special place at the wedding." Snow White wrote a letter to the dwarfs. It said, "Dear dwarfs, I am getting married to the prince. You are all invited to the wedding at the castle. Please come and celebrate with us. Love, Snow White." The forest birds flew with the letter to the dwarfs' cottage. When the dwarfs read the letter, they were overjoyed. "Snow White is getting married," shouted Happy. "This is wonderful news," said Doc. "She deserves to be happy," said Bashful. The dwarfs began to prepare. They cleaned their clothes and polished their shoes. They gathered flowers as a gift for Snow White. On the day of the wedding, they walked together to the castle, singing cheerful songs. Meanwhile, the magic mirror told the queen, Snow White is alive. She is marrying a prince and will live happily ever after. The queen was furious. "This cannot be," she screamed. She tried to cast another evil spell, but her powers had weakened. The people in the kingdom learned of her wickedness and decided she must be punished. The queen was sent far away, never to harm anyone again. The wedding day was bright and sunny. The castle was decorated with flowers and ribbons. People from all over the kingdom came to celebrate. The dwarfs arrived and were given a place of honor near Snow White and the prince. They felt proud to be part of the special day. Snow White wore a beautiful white dress. The prince wore a golden suit. They exchanged vows and rings, promising to love each other forever. When the ceremony ended, everyone clapped and cheered. After the wedding, there was a grand feast in the castle. Long tables were filled with delicious food, roasted meat, fresh bread, sweet cakes, and fruits. The dwarfs sat with Snow White and the prince. "This is the best day ever," said Dopey, eating a large piece of cake. Snow White hugged each dwarf. "Thank you for everything you did for me," she said. "I will always be grateful." The dwarf smiled. "We are happy to see you happy," said Grumpy, though he secretly wiped a tear from his eye. Snow White and the prince built a life filled with love and kindness. They often visited the dwarfs in the forest, bringing gifts and stories from the castle. The dwarfs continued their happy lives, knowing their dear friend was safe and loved. The kingdom flourished under the rule of Snow White and the prince. They were loved by everyone for their fairness and care. The story of Snow White teaches us that kindness, courage, and love can overcome even the greatest challenges. And so, Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after,